She was left humiliated at the altar, but what followed wasn't heartbreak. It was a jaw-dropping uncovering of secrets, corruption, and a love tested by fire. What began as a ruined wedding turned into a fight for justice, a hidden USB, and a second chance no one saw coming. You won't believe how this bride's courage changed everything. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories every week. Eleanor Winters had never been the type to daydream about weddings. While other little girls imagined lace veils and sweeping ballrooms, Ellie was the one scribbling stories in worn journals and watching the world through a lens of realism. But love, real, raw, imperfect love, had found her anyway, and it had a name: Gregory Hayes. He was 4 years older, with a quiet confidence, a disarming smile, and a brilliance that made you lean in when he spoke. So when he proposed after 2 years together, right there on her parents' porch with her mother's hydrangeas blooming in the background, she had said yes without hesitation. Now, on this bright spring afternoon, Ellie stood at the edge of the garden aisle, her father offering his arm with a proud smile. The air was sweet, with the scent of white roses, and the soft strains of a cello floated through the countryside air. Guests, neighbors, cousins, old professors, stood and turned, gasping slightly as Ellie appeared in her sleek ivory gown. She clutched her bouquet, heart fluttering. Not from nerves, she trusted Greg. She knew him, or at least she thought she did. She took slow, graceful steps, locking eyes with Susan, her best friend and maid of honor, who gave her an encouraging wink. But then her gaze lifted toward the altar. Greg was waiting there in a charcoal gray suit, hands clasped in front of him. But something was off. His face, normally warm, soft around the edges, looked rigid, haunted almost. He didn't smile. He didn't look odd or emotional. He looked like a man trapped in a room with no doors. Ellie's steps faltered, but only slightly. Maybe he was nervous. This was a big moment after all. Maybe he hadn't slept. Maybe. She reached him. Her father gave her hand to Greg, who took it, but not the way he usually did. Not with that reassuring squeeze. His grip was limp, awkward, like he was holding something fragile he didn't want to break but didn't know how to carry. The officiant began to speak, his voice reverberating softly against the stone walls of the estate courtyard. Ellie tried to focus, but her pulse roared in her ears. She glanced at Greg again. His jaw was clenched. His eyes were locked on the horizon. She wanted to whisper to him, ask if he was all right, but before she could, the officiant paused mid-sentence. "The groom has requested to say a few words," he announced, confusion tightening his brow. A hush fell over the guests. Greg cleared his throat. Ellie's hand slipped from his as he stepped forward. "I'm sorry," he began, voice trembling just enough to betray the storm behind his composure. "I can't go through with this." Time stopped. "I've been living a lie," he continued, his eyes fixed on the ground. "And I can't start a marriage based on deception. It wouldn't be fair to Eleanor, not to any of you." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Chairs creaked. Someone whispered Ellie's name. Her ears buzzed like she'd been dropped underwater. She didn't move, couldn't move. Greg kept talking, something about mistakes, about someone else, about trying to end it but not being able to. She couldn't absorb the words. She could only feel the dull, crushing weight of them landing on her chest, one after another. She heard Susan curse under her breath. Her father reached for her arm. Her mother sobbed into a handkerchief. But Ellie remained still. And then, like a movie scene cracking apart from its script, Susan stormed forward and slapped Greg so hard the echo bounced off the stone walls. "Coward," she hissed. "You couldn't have said this before today? Before you humiliated her in front of everyone she loves?" Greg didn't respond. He just stepped back, as if shrinking under the weight of his own cowardice. The officiant looked lost. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few got up and left, murmuring apologies. The moment should have broken her. And maybe a part of Ellie did break right there on that altar, but another part, a part she hadn't known existed, stood up inside her. She took a breath, stepped forward, and turned to the crowd. Her voice, when it came, was shockingly steady. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "This wedding is clearly over. But the reception? I paid for that. There's champagne, a live band, and filet mignon. If anyone wants to help me enjoy a very expensive party, I'd be honored." It was the kind of thing that would become legend. The way Eleanor Winters didn't crumble, didn't flee or scream. The way she stood in her wedding gown, chin high, and made a room full of stunned guests laugh through their discomfort. She walked off the altar, not with her groom, but with her dignity. And Susan beside her, gripping her hand tightly. What none of them knew yet, not even Ellie, was that Greg hadn't just walked away from the wedding to break her heart. He had done it to protect her from something far more dangerous. And this ruined wedding was only the beginning. The reception was a strange kind of beautiful. Candlelight flickered across linen-covered tables, jazz music murmured from a small trio in the corner, and servers moved nervously through the crowd, unsure of what tone to strike in a room filled with shattered expectations. Some guests had already left, unwilling to sip champagne under the weight of gossip. Others lingered, half out of loyalty, half out of curiosity, because nobody could quite believe what they'd just witnessed. Eleanor sat at the sweetheart table, no longer flanked by a groom but by Susan, whose jaw was still tight with rage. Ellie lifted her champagne flute with a faint smile, toasted to no one, and sipped. "You don't have to put on a show, you know," Susan said gently. "I'm not," Ellie replied. "This is the calm before whatever storm is next. Might as well enjoy the expensive hors d'oeuvres." They both laughed briefly, but the air remained heavy. Out of the corner of her eye, Ellie saw someone approaching. Lena Hayes, Greg's younger sister. They'd only met a few times, always pleasant but distant. Tonight, Lena looked as though she'd aged 5 years in the span of 1 hour. Her eyes were rimmed with worry, and she clutched her hands together like she was holding something fragile. "Can I talk to you?" Lena asked, her voice just above a whisper. Susan straightened in her chair. "About what?" Ellie gave a slight nod. "It's okay. 5 minutes." They moved to a quiet corner of the courtyard, just past the roses Ellie had personally chosen. Lena didn't sit. She paced, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't know he was going to do that, I swear," she said, "but I do know why he did." Ellie stiffened, her fingers tightening around her glass. "Let me guess. There is another woman." Lena shook her head. "No, it's not that. I mean, it's not what you think. He did this because he was trying to protect you." "From what?" Ellie's voice was soft, almost too calm. Lena looked over her shoulder, checking for eavesdroppers. "Greg's been involved in something big. At his company, he found out they were moving large amounts of money, offshore accounts, shell companies. He started digging deeper and found connections to people with serious power, people who don't like being watched." A bitter laugh escaped Ellie's throat. "So he broke my heart to keep me safe? That's convenient." "I'm serious," Lena said. "He wouldn't talk to anyone about it, not even me. But I know he's been meeting with someone secretly, some woman who's not with the company. I don't know her name. I thought it might be an affair at first, but then I saw documents, notes, USBs. He was compiling evidence. I think he was preparing to blow the whistle." Ellie stared at her. The pieces didn't quite fit, but they were starting to line up on the table. "Why now?" she asked. "Why today?" Lena hesitated. "He said if he married you, they'd come after you too, that they'd see you as leverage. He thought, maybe if he embarrassed you, made you walk away from him, you'd be out of their line of sight." Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to dismiss it as melodrama, a fantasy Greg had constructed to excuse what he'd done. But a part of her remembered the way he looked on the altar. Not cruel, not cold, just terrified. A familiar voice cut through the music. "Greg's, Ellie." She turned. He stood at the edge of the courtyard, breathless, like he'd been running. His tie was gone, hair slightly damp, and his eyes scanned the guests until they locked on hers. "What the hell is he doing here?" Susan muttered, appearing like a storm cloud beside Ellie. Greg took a step closer. "Please, I need to talk to you. Now." "No," Susan said sharply, moving in front of Ellie. "You made your speech. You don't get an encore." But Greg didn't back down. "You don't understand. I didn't tell the truth back there. Not all of it. And if I don't say what needs to be said now, someone else will make sure I never get the chance." His voice cracked on the last word. Ellie could see it now, his pupils wide, his shoulders tense, his hands slightly trembling. Susan scoffed. "This is turning into a soap opera." "No," Ellie said quietly. "Let him talk." Susan hesitated, then stepped aside. Ellie walked up to Greg, stopping just inches away. "You have 30 seconds, she said. "Not here," Greg replied. Too many ears. The library inside. Please. You, me, and bring Susan if you have to. Ellie hesitated, then nodded once. 10 minutes later, the three of them sat in the estate's old mahogany library, the air thick with the scent of leather and dust. Ellie folded her hands in her lap and waited. Greg didn't waste time. I lied. There's no other woman. I said that to make you hate me. Because if we got married, Ellie, you'd be tied to me legally. And that means they'd have reason to watch you, question you, follow you. Who are they? Susan asked. Her lawyer's mind was already turning gears. Greg looked directly at Ellie. There's something hidden in your bouquet. Something they'll kill for. And I had to put it in the safest place I could think of, somewhere no one would suspect. Ellie's fingers twitched involuntarily. Greg lowered his voice. The USB drive. It's in the roses. Ellie didn't speak for a long moment. She simply stared at Greg, her mind spinning like a wheel on ice. The USB was in the bouquet. The bouquet she had nearly tossed in anger. The bouquet she had clutched through the ceremony and brought to the reception as a symbol of defiance. And now, it apparently held the kind of evidence people would kill for? Susan, arms crossed, arched a skeptical brow. You put federal-level evidence in her wedding flowers? Greg ran a hand down his face, clearly exhausted. It was the only place no one would check. Everyone thinks I'm a coward, that I bailed because I cheated. No one would imagine I was protecting the key to bring down an entire criminal enterprise inside a bunch of roses. Ellie stood slowly. Her voice was soft, measured. Who exactly are you running from, Greg? He looked at her, jaw tightening. Victor, and the men backing him. Investors, politicians, people laundering millions through fake real estate projects. I only figured it out because they were too sloppy. One wire transfer led to another, and suddenly I was neck deep in something too big to ignore. And what? You thought you could expose them all yourself? Susan asked, arms still crossed but her eyes less judgmental now. I had help, he said. A journalist, she's in hiding now, but the bulk of our findings, everything, it's in that USB. A sudden noise interrupted them, a sharp crack from the hallway. All three heads snapped toward the door. What was that? Ellie whispered. Footsteps. Heavy. Measured. Greg paled. They're here. Susan moved fast, slipping off her heels and pressing herself against the bookshelf, gesturing for Ellie and Greg to stay low. The door creaked open just slightly, and a man's voice called out, overly casual. Greg, you in here? Victor Dalton stepped inside. His tailored suit was immaculate. His tone was friendly, but his eyes were cold steel. Behind him, two men, tall, built, no smiles. Not guests, not friends. Greg stood slowly, pushing Ellie slightly behind him. Victor glanced around the room. Now this is cozy. Bride, groom, and legal counsel. How quaint. Ellie's heart thundered. Her eyes flitted to the bouquet, still resting on the corner table beside the fireplace, elegant and unassuming. I came to deliver a little advice, Victor said, strolling closer, his voice low and dangerously smooth. Drop it. Whatever you think you're doing, whatever files you think you've hidden, it won't end the way you imagine. This isn't a Hollywood movie. Greg clenched his fists. You don't scare me? Then you're not paying attention, Victor said and nodded once to the man on his left. The man took a step forward, and that was when the second door to the library burst open. A fourth figure entered, older, rugged, with a weathered trench coat and the calm, solid posture of a man who'd seen war. Harold Boone, he said, flashing a badge. Retired detective. I suggest you leave. Victor turned slowly, visibly calculating. Ah, the small-town lawman. You don't have jurisdiction here, Harold. No, Boone replied. But I have a reputation, and a shotgun in my truck if things get messy. The tension crackled like static in the air. Victor held Boone's gaze for several long seconds before giving a tight smile. Fine, we'll step out. But don't mistake mercy for weakness, Gregory. You've drawn the wrong kind of attention. I won't be far. With that, he turned on his heel, his men following him out like well-trained dogs. When the door shut behind them, Ellie finally exhaled. Her hands trembled slightly. Boone turned to her. Is it true? You've got something big? Ellie nodded and crossed the room. She picked up the bouquet carefully, peeled back the ribbon, and slid her fingers inside until she felt it. A small flash drive, cool and solid. This is it, she whispered. Boone looked to Greg. We can't stay here. They'll be back, and next time they won't just be talking. Susan grabbed her purse. We'll take my car. My place is too obvious. Where can we go? I have a cabin, Boone said. Off the grid, North Woods, no cell signal, no neighbors. We'll be safe long enough to figure out our next move. Ellie nodded slowly, her eyes on Greg. You said you wanted to protect me. Well, now you'd better, because we're all in this together. Greg reached for her hand. She let him take it. Outside, the moon was rising above the hills, casting long shadows on the grass. The wedding was over, the guests were gone, but the story was only just beginning. The drive north felt like something out of a different lifetime. Eleanor sat in the backseat of Susan's SUV, her bouquet cradled in her lap like a newborn. Every bump in the road made her flinch. She didn't speak much. None of them did. Susan gripped the wheel with both hands, eyes locked on the dark, winding road ahead. Greg sat in the passenger seat, silent, jaw tight, fingers twitching on his knees. And in the very back, Harold Boone's calm voice occasionally broke the silence with quiet directions. By the time they reached the cabin, the night was heavy and still. The old wooden structure stood deep in the pines, hidden from the road, its porch sagging slightly under the weight of time. It was exactly the kind of place no one would look for a runaway bride with national secrets in her wedding bouquet. Boone moved like a man who trusted no one, not even the trees. He swept the perimeter, checked the locks, and only when he was satisfied did he usher them inside. The air inside was musty but warm. A fire crackled in the hearth. Ellie sat down on the worn leather sofa and stared at the bouquet in her hands. She peeled back the ribbon and slid the USB from its hiding place, holding it out to Greg. He didn't take it. No, he said softly. You hold on to it. They already think I have it. If they catch up to us, they'll be watching me, not you. Susan, already unpacking her laptop from her bag, glanced up. So what's on this thing exactly? And I mean exactly, Greg. If I'm risking a felony just breathing in the same air as this evidence, I need to know what we're dealing with. Greg pulled a chair closer to the fire. His voice was low but firm. It's more than just wire transfers or shady invoices. It's recordings, meetings between Victor and government officials, surveillance footage, internal memos from his company. There are people tied to this, all the way up to the state legislature. They're using fake construction projects to funnel dirty money, drug money, weapon sales, offshore accounts. I started noticing inconsistencies 6 months ago, and once I pulled one thread, the whole thing started unraveling. Why didn't you go to the authorities? Ellie asked. I tried, Greg said. Twice. One contact disappeared. The second got into a car accident 2 weeks later. After that, I realized this thing is protected. I needed a clean way to expose it. That's when I met the journalist. And the wedding? Susan asked. You thought humiliating Ellie was the best cover? Greg looked at Ellie, shame plain in his eyes. I thought if I made you hate me, you'd walk away from me. And from the danger. I didn't think they'd come after you if you weren't tied to me. Well, you thought wrong, Ellie said quietly, because they came anyway. And now we're all here, hiding in the woods like fugitives. Boone returned from the back hallway, a shotgun now propped casually in his hands. So the plan's simple. You three go through that drive, figure out what's useful, and I'll keep watch. If anyone shows up, we're ready. Susan plugged the USB into her laptop, the screen casting a bluish glow across the room. A folder popped open. Files, subfolders, video clips, PDFs. As they began reviewing the contents, the pieces clicked into place. Contracts signed with fake names, photos of briefcases exchanged in parking lots, audio files of Victor's voice discussing payoffs in a hushed tone. This is massive, Susan whispered, enough to bury a dozen people. We need to get this to someone who'll actually do something, Ellie said. Boone nodded. I know a federal prosecutor, old friend from back in the day. She's clean. She hates corruption. I'll call her from town tomorrow, from a payphone. Greg looked up sharply. If you call her, they'll know we're making moves. They already know, Boone said. We've been quiet for too long. Time to push. They worked into the early hours of the morning. Ellie barely noticed how cold her feet had gotten, or how stiff her fingers were from flipping through documents. She watched Greg closely, not with the love she once held for him, but with the curiosity of someone seeing a man for the first time without the haze of emotion. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't a hero. But he was trying. And somewhere in the mess of betrayal, shame, and bravery, she saw something she didn't expect to find again. Trust. As the sun began to rise, casting a soft gold across the frosted windows, Susan finally leaned back and closed the laptop. "We've got enough. We'll make the call." Ellie stood and stepped outside onto the porch. The world was quiet, peaceful even. A far cry from the whirlwind of her wedding day. She took a breath of sharp pine air and looked down at her empty hands. No bouquet, no ring, just the knowledge that she was now part of something bigger, something dangerous. Yes, but also something that might just make the world a little less corrupt. Behind her, Greg stepped out. He didn't say anything. He just stood beside her in silence. She didn't look at him, but for the first time since the altar, she didn't pull away either. The press called it the Hayes scandal, though Eleanor's name was never far behind in the headlines. Runaway groom, explosive files, and a wedding that shook the state. But Ellie didn't read the articles. She didn't have the time or the appetite for reliving what had happened that night in the woods and all that came after. Boone's contact, the federal prosecutor, had come through. Within days of receiving the drive, she launched a quiet but aggressive operation. Raids happened simultaneously across 3 cities. Victor Dalton was arrested in a sleek penthouse in Chicago, his face pale, his wrists cuffed in polished silver. A dozen more were taken down: CEOs, local officials, campaign donors. Every one of them tangled in the same corrupt web Greg had helped expose. Greg himself was briefly detained, not as a suspect but as a cooperating witness. He was offered immunity in exchange for a full debrief and testimony. He took the deal without hesitation, but not before asking Susan to represent him. She did, with the kind of fire Ellie had always admired, unrelenting, articulate, and sharp as glass. Ellie stayed quiet through it all. She returned to her small home in the countryside, away from the buzzing cameras and whispers of scandal. At first, she tried to write, to journal it all out the way she had when she was younger. But every time she put pen to paper, her mind flooded with the sound of her own name being whispered behind champagne glasses. So she let herself rest. She gardened. She walked the dog she'd once rescued from a shelter and now credited with saving her own peace. And sometimes, she sat under the old oak tree in the back of her property, bouquet long since dried and tied with twine, remembering not the betrayal, but the bravery it took to walk forward anyway. Greg reached out 6 weeks later. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't send flowers or write grand apologies. He just sent a letter. Simple, handwritten, honest. "I made a mess. I did the wrong thing for what I thought were the right reasons. But I would do anything to rebuild your trust, even if it means starting as strangers again." She didn't write back. Not at first. But the letter stayed on her kitchen table, folded neatly, read at least a dozen times. And when the trial dates rolled around, and Greg testified with calm conviction about everything he had uncovered, when he spoke her name not in pain, but with respect, Ellie felt something in her begin to soften. 6 months passed. And then one Sunday afternoon in the garden her mother once planted, beneath soft lantern light and surrounded by no more than 15 people who had truly stood by her side, Eleanor Winters married Gregory Hayes. There was no altar, no classical quartet, just a circle of laughter, wildflowers, and second chances. Boone walked her down the makeshift aisle, tie slightly crooked and a proud grin on his face. Susan stood beside her again, this time as officiant, grumbling about writing the vows herself. Lena brought a lemon tart instead of flowers and cried through the entire ceremony. And Greg stood there not as a polished executive or secret whistleblower, but simply as a man who had nearly lost everything and knew exactly what it meant to earn it back. Ellie's vows were short. "I don't promise perfection," she said, voice steady, "but I promise truth. And love that doesn't run, not even when things fall apart." When they kissed, it wasn't dramatic or theatrical. It was quiet, filled with a sense of homecoming, of survival. It was 2 people who had walked through fire, together, apart and together again, and come out not flawless but forged. Later, as they danced beneath the stars to the sound of soft jazz playing from a portable speaker, Ellie rested her head against Greg's chest and whispered, "No gunman this time." Greg chuckled, tightening his arms around her. "Not unless Boone brought a +1. They laughed quietly, swaying with the rhythm of something bigger than music. Relief, perhaps, or peace. In the months that followed, Ellie turned the experience into something more. She worked with the prosecutor's office to start a fund for whistleblower protection. She gave talks at universities about resilience, transparency, and the power of personal integrity. And sometimes, when the headlines shifted to other scandals and other names, someone would ask her if she regretted what happened. She'd always pause, then smile softly. "No," she'd say, "because sometimes you have to lose the life you planned to find the one you were meant to live." And that bouquet, the one that once held fear and secrets and betrayal, it now sat in a shadow box on her study wall, not as a symbol of ruin, but as a reminder that even in the most broken moments, there is beauty and hope and the start of something unexpected and beautiful. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this powerful story. If you're still here, it means something in Eleanor's journey spoke to you, and we're grateful you listened. This wasn't just a story about a ruined wedding. It was about truth, resilience, and finding courage when the world crumbles around you. Sometimes life pulls us off course, breaks us down, and takes everything we thought was certain. But as Eleanor showed us, it's in those moments, when we're forced to confront the unexpected, that we often discover our true strength. Let this be a reminder. Not every ending is a failure. Sometimes, it's just the beginning of a better path. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? What part of Eleanor's story moved you the most? If you found value in this video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story that might just change the way you see life. We share real, emotional, and inspiring stories every week, just like this one. Until next time, take care and never underestimate the power of your own story.